morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for taking the time to be with me this morning to talk about scenario-based development and testing, doing it right the first time. During the webinar, if you have any question, please go ahead and click on the questions tab, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can at the end of the webinar. This webinar is sponsored and hosted by Romana Software, the leader in integrated application lifecycle management. You can visit Romana Software at romanasoftware.com. You can subscribe to a free 60 days trial for up to 3 people to explore the features of Romana ALM. My name is Magdi Hanna. I'm actually the Chief Technical Officer of Romana ALM, and in case some of you know me through the International Institute for Software Testing, I'm also the Chairman and CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing. Let's start today's presentation on scenario-based development and testing, doing it right the first time. Everyone is interested in doing everything right the first time, whatever you do. In software development, we always say we need to do it right the first time, which means we want to release software where we do not receive so many bug reports from the test team or from the customer after release. We all understand this is very difficult. So this is just an attempt. And that's the best way I know of, based on my 40 plus years experience, the best way I know of how to actually do it right the first time. How do you develop software in a way that does not have too many bugs? You still have bugs. There is no such a thing that bug-free software or zero defect, as some people say. There is no such thing, but we strive to achieve that. All right. I am going to discuss with you what scenario-based development and testing is, how it helps teams to do it in a way that avoids defects. So I call this also the most effective way to prevent defects upfront. Okay, people speak about defect prevention. And there's so many things are talked about, such as code reviews, design reviews. I'm sorry if you are doing code review or design review or doing testing, you are not preventing defects. Okay, as I always say, if you can find a defect, then you did not prevent it. Preventing defects means that you do not find defects. So any method, and that's my opinion, any method by which we find defect is a method for finding a defect. Is never a way to prevent a defect. Keep that in mind. Here's some facts that many of you already know. Whether you are working with requirements or user stories, they're always incomplete. By incomplete means that they do not have all the details we need in order to develop the software or to develop the feature or test the feature. All right, that's always the case. I'm sure you know that. I know that. In my own experience, I have not seen one single requirement, whether someone else wrote it or I wrote it, that I can consider complete. Every requirement is missing details. Most of those details that we need come during development. They come during development by asking questions to the product owner in an agile project, or to the business analyst in a non-agile project, or asking the customer, or asking someone. All right. They also come up during development from assumptions made by developers, which we don't know if those assumptions are true or not. Typically, many developers make assumptions about missing details. However, they don't do a very good job in validating those assumptions with someone that's supposed to validate them. And again, as I always say, any assumption you make about anything will remain invalid until you validate it. Keep that in mind. Any assumption you make that you have not validated it with whoever is supposed to validate it, then it is, you can just assume that it is invalid. It doesn't matter what it is. That's my experience. I work with developers every day. I've worked with developers for over 32, 35 years now. I know what kind of assumptions developers make. They don't share them with others, and we end up by having a feature implemented in a certain way that's based on wrong assumptions. Okay. We also know that during the development, many adjustments to the requirements and the user story happen, especially in Agile projects, because Agile is supposed to be flexible. Agile is supposed to accommodate customers for the changes they need. So we do a lot of prototyping. We show the customer what we've done, or we show the product owner, and then they can possibly suggest some changes. So in my own experience, I have the result at the bottom of the screen. If we try to test it, and this is for test professionals, if we try to test it based on requirements or based on user stories, we are not covering even half of what is in the code. Why? Because the code, as always, have much more than what's in the requirement or what's in the user story, what's in the acceptance criteria. As a result, we actually have systems that we put out that has a very low level of code coverage. Code coverage is a very dangerous thing. When we have a system out there that has a low level of code coverage, that means that there is code that was written by developers that's out in production that has not been tested. And this is terrible. I have seen systems that have code coverage down to 55 and 60%, which is bad. That means that there is 40% of the code has not been tested. So hopefully the method I'm going to explain to you are going to help you avoid all that. So the result now, or the recommendation now, is if you're having requirements or user stories, if you are working on Agile projects, and developers started doing this, or testers are taking the requirements and writing tests, or developers are taking the requirements and writing their design and their code, I am going to very, very clearly and bluntly say, this does not work. We cannot do this anymore. No requirement-based testing, no requirement-based design and decoding. So the solution is really what I call scenario-based development and testing. There might be something you heard of before. In fact, if you've taken one of my courses that I teach for the International Institute for Software Testing, I discuss this methodology in all details. People practice it in the classroom or in the interactive session, the virtual class, and people learn it all in details there. So here's simply what the process is. You start with whatever you have. You might have a requirement. If you are purely non-Agile, you might have user stories. You might have both requirements and user stories. You certainly are going to have some user interface if the applications have user interface. Of course, there is so many other systems that may not have user interface, but those are not intended for use by users. If the system is to be used by users, though, it has user interface presented in some form of screen or whatever, or menus. You may also, if your project is following a more formal methodology, you may also have use cases. Keep in mind, use cases are different from user stories. If you have not seen use cases before, use cases are much more complete than requirements and user stories. They have a number of paths or scenarios. We call them the happy path, the alternate path. The bottom line is use cases are very powerful when it comes to interactions between systems and subsystems. That's the unique thing about use cases. So whatever your project has, I suggest that we have a collaborative discussion reviews for whatever entity we have. And that means that we don't have to meet. We don't have to take the user story or the requirement or anything and sit down in a meeting. People don't like meeting much, so the way I do it and the way I have been doing it for over 15 years now is using a collaboration tool. Like the tool I'm going to show you, Romana Romana ALM. It's an ALM tool, but has a collaboration piece to it. All right. Any tool, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're using Jira, you can use Jira for collaboration. You put out the user story or the requirement or the use case or whatever it is, and allow people to talk about it, to have questions, to comment, and things like that. At the same time, when we are doing the collaborative review and discussions, we are building scenarios and validating those scenarios. So these two steps here are very much at the same time. They are iterative. And of course, during the scenario validation here, we might discover that we need to have more scenarios. As we learn that we need more scenarios, we may have more discussions about it, and we may have to go back to the requirement or the user story or the use case and modify them. So it's three activities happening at the same time: revising the requirements, user story or use case, or the user interface, asking questions and getting answers, building scenarios, all happen collaboratively. Now, what you see here is what I call the use case scenarios. In the heart of use cases, there is those things, as I say, it called the path. There is the happy path, there is the alternate paths. And if you look at those paths, they are very much like scenarios. So people ask me all the time, what is the difference between scenarios you build here from a requirement or user story or user interface and scenarios here that are coming from use cases? I say scenarios are scenarios. As we're going to discuss now, a scenario is simply a phrase that describes a situation or a condition that could possibly happen in production. Now, the only difference between the two types of scenarios is that scenarios coming from use cases include much more information. They have preconditions, they have post-conditions, they have steps to be followed to achieve that scenario, and many other details. Scenarios here that we build are nothing more than one phrase or one sentence that describes the situation or the condition we're trying to describe. Okay, so in a way, possibly a scenario that we build here with this process is just the title of a use case scenario, right? Once we build the scenarios, whether they are based on these three things or they are based on use cases, as you can see here, the same scenarios go to the development team to do scenario-based unit testing. I'm sure you heard, if you're working on an Agile project, you probably heard about test-driven development. And in test-driven development, developers are supposed to take a requirement or a user story and they start building their unit testing test cases. And I say that's totally wrong, because if the requirement or the user story is incomplete, then their test cases that they write are also incomplete. That's why I would strongly recommend doing the test-driven development based on scenarios. So the scenarios would be the input to the test-driven development. That's, of course, if your team is agile and if your team is doing test-driven development. And once they do their test-driven development, they started writing their code and their design, and they execute their tests. That's in the development side. In the test side, the QA team will take the same scenarios and will write their test cases and test script. This is the highest level view of the process. There's so much details to this. Imagine a process that I explain over 3 days. I'm not going to be able to explain it in all details here in 1 hour. All right, so let's talk about what is a scenario. And the scenario is a very generic term that people use it in many ways. So here is a definition of a scenario in this process. It's any situation or a condition that could possibly happen in production and that the system needs to handle it or respond to it. Of course, there might be other things happening in production that the system really doesn't care about. So anything at all that could possibly happen, normal or abnormal, that's why I classify scenarios to be positive scenarios or negative scenarios. Sorry, typo here, missing the word or. Positive or negative scenarios. Negative scenarios are very important because if you look at all the bug reports we receive from customers, they are because one of these three things. Most importantly, about abnormal or extreme or uncommon conditions that were encountered in production that the system did not account for. And as a result, the system did not know how to handle them. So that's the most common one. The next common one is the shall not do. Shall not do is a very critical thing too, because if you look at our requirements or user stories, they're all about things that the user shall be able to do. The user stories always say, as a person doing whatever, I'd like to be able to do this. We don't normally see a user story that says, as a customer, I do not want to do this. As a user, I do not want to do this. Okay, or I should not be able to do this. There is so many shall not do behavior, shall not do scenarios that people do anyway, either intentionally or unintentionally. And if the system is not prepared to work with those, to handle those, then they become major source of defects. So that's why the scenario process, the scenario development and testing process really focus on these things. Of course, the last type of negative scenarios are the ones that you are most familiar with, which is the use of any invalid data. But again, remember, using invalid data does not necessarily come from the user, from a keyboard. The data comes from different places. For a given system that's a very reasonably complex system, I mean, input can come from files, it can come from other systems, can come from sensors. And if we have not analyzed all the data coming into the system and accounted for invalid data and how the system must handle it, that's a major source of defects as well. So something to keep in mind, even if you're not going to use the scenario based development and testing, in whatever process you're using, I want you to focus so much on the negative behavior characterized by these three types. All right, here are some example scenarios. If I have a requirement here, remember, a requirement is not much different from a user story, except that a requirement has much more text than a user story. This requirement here says customer shall be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. If this was to be written or were to be written as a user story, it would have been written such like that. As a customer, I'd like to be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. Or perhaps you would split it into two different user stories. The first one says, as a customer, I want to be able to place orders online. And the second one is that as a customer, I want to pay for my orders using credit card. Okay. Nevertheless, whether it's a requirement or a user story, here are some of the scenarios. As you can tell, the four scenarios listed there are things that could possibly happen in production while the system is working. And there's much more scenarios. I just wrote four scenarios so that I can fit the whole thing on one slide here. Now, once you see those scenarios, some of you who have worked with acceptance criteria for user stories in Agile projects, you might say, well, that looks like our acceptance criteria that we use. I have another webinar that's currently recorded and available at the International Institute for Software Testing website. It's at testinginstitute.com. If you go to testinginstitute.com and go to free webinars, we have a number of recorded webinars there. Please look at the webinar scenario versus acceptance criteria. In that 1 hour webinar, I clearly explained the difference between acceptance criteria and scenarios. I also discuss all in details in all the courses, especially the test design courses for agile projects that I teach for the institute, because it's important. If you know about acceptance criteria, you need to know how different they are from scenarios, and you will see they are different. Or at the very least, you will learn about scenarios enough to be able to elaborate on acceptance criteria to make them as elaborate as scenarios are. So I'm not suggesting that you throw away your acceptance criteria and replace them with scenarios. I am just suggesting that you use the ideas and the concepts in scenarios and use them to enrich your acceptance criteria if your project insists on using acceptance criteria. Now, I've seen a lot of people, many people come to my courses that they have been using acceptance criteria for years. When they learn scenarios, they say, we're going to keep acceptance criteria as they are because they're really not on that on that low level as the scenarios, but we're going to build also scenarios along with the acceptance criteria. So they end up by having both. Well, I will leave this up to you when you watch my webinar on the difference between scenarios and the acceptance criteria, and you decide for yourself. All right. So who writes scenarios? Well, in agile projects, sometimes it's actually only the product owner who writes acceptance criteria. Well, when we come to scenarios, everyone can actually contribute to scenarios. Anyone who knows how the system is supposed to behave. So the people who are writing requirements or user stories can write scenarios. Developers can participate in the process. If you have an agile project, product owner can participate in the process, or the test team. In my experience, it is always the test team that takes the lead to develop scenarios. I hate to say this, it is just because the test team is the only team that cares about testing, and they want to make sure that they test things the right way, so they develop scenarios. The problem sometimes is that they do not share those scenarios back with developers or with the product owner, or they do not validate those scenarios with others. So with the process I'm talking about here, testers will be writing scenarios, they will be sharing them back with the developers because they want to make sure that developers are aware of those scenarios that are going to be tested. I want to go back to the same picture I showed you here. So when testers here build the scenarios, they're not supposed to work in isolation and write test cases and test design based on the scenarios, but rather they're supposed to go back to developers and make sure that those developers are aware of those scenarios. The reason is this. You want to make sure that developers are writing the code and the design that can handle every scenario you have. Otherwise, if you as a tester start writing scenarios and test them, and the developers are not aware of them, what's going to happen is that you're going to be busy writing a lot of bug reports. And you want to avoid that as well. Because if I write scenarios and use them to design my tests, I have not prevented defects. I waited for developers to give me code that already has defect. And then I'm finding those defects by testing. So the trick here is that developers will be building based on those scenarios, such that when I go here and run and execute my scenarios or execute my test cases that are built based on scenarios, then I do not find the level of defects I used to find. Let me tell you, I have major companies who've tried this over the years. And I have companies who have reported to me in many ways that they were able to reduce the number of bug reports in the field by more than 70%. When you are able to do this, that's what I consider defect prevention. That's what I consider doing it right the first time, at least 30%. So, which means the number of defects that are left are only 30% of what they used to find. And those other defects are attributed to operational environments and other things. But if you if you have decided to listen to me today, trust my experience. This process will reduce the number of defects written by the tested team as well as written by your customers for more than 70–80%. You will still have some defects, but not as many as you used to have. So remember, writing bug reports is very time consuming. We know that. And giving them back to the developer, waiting for the developer to fix them, going back to retest the fix, that's all time consuming. Not only that, but as you know, when developers fix a problem, you know what some developers do. Unintentionally, they create other problems. They break things that used to work before, and I call those regression errors. And those regression errors, if we don't catch them during regression testing, guess what? They go back to the field, and those are the things that irritate our customers the most, because nothing irritates customers more than things that used to work before and now they're no longer working. So keep that in mind. This picture by itself is not going to do it. It's how you do the process, how you share the scenarios with developers, how you validate scenarios with product owners and business analysts, how you go back and revise your scenarios. Because remember, in this process, developing scenarios are continuously improved through the collaboration process. So the collaboration process here is really what you use to make sure that everyone is buying into your scenario. So in my opinion, anyone can participate in the scenario process. There are two major ways by which we can build the scenarios. The one I explain the most to people is the informal one. Whether one person sitting writing scenarios or a group of people, but I always recommend that if one person is going to build the scenarios, then he or she has to make sure they get collaboratively reviewed and validated by everyone else. In one of the courses I teach for IIST, the course titled Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design, I give them a real requirement and ask individuals to go ahead and build scenarios. And then I ask people to start working in teams of 4 or 5 people, and to see the difference between scenarios that are built individually versus scenarios that are built in collaboration with everyone else. And people find out that if they work in a team, they can produce 5 or 6 times the number of scenarios that they can develop individually. All right. Remember, scenarios are all about requirement coverage. If you give me a requirement or a user story and I write only 5 scenarios, but someone else can take the same user story and write 25 scenarios, then guess what? My requirement coverage is only 20% of the requirement coverage that the other person can achieve. That's very important. So as a result, if I can have 4 or 5 people working together and they come up with more scenarios, then I'm actually achieving higher levels of requirement coverage. Now, of course, for some other requirements and all user stories that are more complex, we can use some of those models. And I already mentioned use cases. Some of you might be familiar with decision tables or decision trees. Very interesting that those techniques have existed in literature for years. No one thought of them as a way of building scenarios. State models are very powerful techniques for a specific kind of requirements. And when you use them, you'll find out you are discovering situations and or conditions that could possibly happen in production. Absolutely, user interface, whether it is screens or menus or whatever, when you look at them, you can build more scenarios more than what you can build based on the requirements and the user stories. When it comes to scenario validation, I'm suggesting that everyone participates in the validation. Absolutely. Because the person or the group who are writing scenarios, they don't know if those scenarios are valid or not. Okay, so that's through the collaboration process, developers, product owners, and during validation, we look for certain things. We make sure that we did not miss any scenarios. We make sure that we have all positive and all negative situations, and negative scenarios are down there. But most importantly, we agree on expected behavior of scenarios. Of course, some scenarios are trivial enough that we don't have to argue and we don't have to agree on the expected behavior. Placing an order online and paying for it by credit card, if one of the scenarios of this requirement is simply placing an order for something that's available in stock, well, the expected behavior is simply saying, yes, the order will be placed and the credit card will be charged. That's the expected behavior. But if the scenario is something else, like a person gets disconnected from the internet, then we need to agree on how the system should handle the situation. Should the system saves partial order, or should the person start from scratch, or whatever? So we need to agree on expected behavior of scenarios. Once you build all scenarios and you validate them, then you're gonna normally find out that you have much more scenarios than what you can ever test in terms of time. So what do? We follow a risk-based process, but the risk-based here is based on scenarios. When people do risk-based testing, they look at all the test cases they produced and they decide which test cases they will execute. In this case, I'm asking that you do not wait until you write test cases. Rather, on the scenario level, you go and for each one of the scenarios, you decide on these three factors that I call them the impact of failure. If you've done some risk-based analysis before, you know what those means. The impact of failure is simply about the impact of if that scenario would fail in production. Frequency is how often we believe this scenario is going to happen in production, and the probability of failure is what is the likelihood for this scenario to fail. And if you use very simple approach like high, medium, and low, and if you program a spreadsheet that says high means 3 and medium means 2 and low is 1, so you can easily calculate an average here. So 3 plus 2 plus 2 is 7. If you divide them by 3, this gives you 2.33. Down here, 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3, divide them by 3. Very simple calculation for the testing priority. So this number here is always going to be between 1.0 and 3.0, with everything in between, either 1.33, 1.66, 2.33, and 2.66. So since this number has been calculated as an average of these three factors, I can easily treat this number as a testing priority, and I use it to decide which scenarios I am going to test. Now, this column here is simply saying, was this scenario explicitly stated in the requirement or the user story or not? Why is that column there? It's because I want to use it for this column here, because a lot of people say, I don't know if what's the probability of the failure of the scenario. I don't know if the scenario would fail in production or not. So I say one of the simplest facts you can use is that if that scenario is not explicitly stated in the requirement, then I would assume that the developer does not know about it. The developer did not think about it, so most likely the developer did not write code for it, and that's why it has a higher probability of failure. So very straightforward. All the scenarios that are not explicitly stated in the requirement has higher probability of failure. All right, so now once you do this, you can easily sort this spreadsheet on this column, and you bring all the higher testing priority on the top, and then you can think of how much time you have and how many scenarios you can test. And you say, okay, based on the time I have, I may start only with scenarios, for example, that are 2.0 and above, and you find out how many scenarios are there. And let's assume that you have, say, 10 scenarios that are all 10.0 and above. Now, those are the scenarios you're going to start with, but it doesn't mean that I am not going to to test the other scenarios. So you start with the 10, and those are the 10 you're going to be writing test cases for. Now, what are we going to do with the other 20? Well, there's a number of things you can do. You can go back to them, of course, if you have more time, and start selecting more scenarios that are, for example, 1.66. So you can grab another 5 scenarios or so. Or you can start testing them informally. So with this diagram here, so I have a scenario here. I can take some scenarios and test them formally, and that means that I write test cases, I write formal test cases, and I put those test cases in test sets, and I write either automated scripts or manual scripts. Or I can take those 20 scenarios and test them informally using exploratory testing. And of course, in my course on the designing and executing tests for agile projects, I discuss this process in details, how you can take scenarios and test them using exploratory testing. So exploratory testing has to be based on something, and I base it based on those scenarios. So you can actually split your scenarios to test them either formally by writing test cases or informally. I'm sure you have some questions. If you have questions, please go ahead and share them with me. I understand the hour is not enough to share everything with you about this process. Here is how you write the test cases. I'm sure you know how to write test cases, but I just decided to include this slide, which is, you would not see it anywhere else unless you have taken some of my courses. This is my way of writing test cases. A test case has 4 components here, 2 components on the left. The input plus the preconditions will produce a set of post conditions and the output. And here is a definition of each one of those 4 components. As you can see here, in my test cases, I don't have the steps. The steps to execute the test cases are not part of the test cases. I hope some of you already know that. When I write test cases, when you write test cases, you're not supposed to write the steps. The steps are something different. As you can see in my previous chart here, I put the test case here separate from the script, whether it is manual or automated. A test case is simply only the data I'm going to be using to execute the tests. And that data includes the input I'm giving, the preconditions that exist, and includes also the output that I'm expecting, and it also includes the post conditions I'm expecting. I discuss the details of all that in the 3-day course on best practices in software test planning and design. All right, so now we have about 18 minutes left. I'm going to just use them to show you how Romana LM, the most comprehensive ALM tool, does this scenario-based development and testing. Here is a general picture of Romana LM. It has every one of those functions. It has requirement management, user story management, it has project management, it has test design and test management here. It has document management, use cases. Collaboration is a big piece of Romana LM, and it also has issue or bug tracking component, and it has change management when customers change the requirements, they submit a change request, and so on. So I suggest that you go to romanasoftware.com if you're interested to learn more. You can certainly get a free trial for 60 days, which allows 3 people in your team, up to 3 people in your team, to work with the features. And of course, if you need more than 60 days, you just let the support team knows that, right? For now, allow me please to go here. And again, I do this in the last 15, 18 minutes, just in case if you're not interested, you can check out. So when you subscribe for a free trial, or what you get is a site like this, would be your company or your name .romana.com. And when you log in, I'm going to log in as a product owner, project manager, scrum master. So when you log in, you get a list of all the products on the left here, all the systems you worked on with all the projects here. on the left. So I'm highlighting here the Romana LM product because you can imagine we are using the tool to manage the projects of the tool itself. So hope this does not confuse you. So what you're looking at here really is that some previous projects, some older projects. This is release 10.3, this is release 0.3 Agile, this is release 17.3. Those are the previous projects that we have worked on for Romana. I'm going to just open any one of them, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to open this one here. When you open a project, what you get is this dashboard that shows you a number of things that you're interested to see. You can configure this dashboard any way you want by clicking this button here to include statistics. And so here, for example, it's showing you the test execution by status. It tells you how many are failed, how many have not been executed yet, and how many passed. You can include other charts here. This is issue reports by status. Here is issue by priorities, whatever. And you have control over this dashboard. The nice thing about reports and dashboards in Romana LM is that everything is a link. So if someone says, okay, what are those 15 issue reports that are still open? So all what you have to do is you click on this bar here. When you click on this, it opens another screen with the 15 issue reports that are still open, right? You can close this, go back here. If you are on this chart here and you want to see those test cases, 13% or 13.4% of the test cases failed, you can click on that and so on. So leave the dashboard for now. I'm going to go to user stories here, and everything is accessible from the main menu here. You don't have to work hard. People love this user interface. So here are user stories, change requests, test sets, documents and models, reports, and you can go back here. You can click on more. You get more stuff. You get the issue reports here, all the ad hoc / exploratory tests. The use cases are here, and so on. Collaboration Center is here. In Collaboration Center, you can, as you can see, you can initiate user story review. You can initiate the scenario reviews. You can initiate any kind of review. You can actually collaborate in any form you want. So if I go here and open user stories, as you can see, user stories are documented in a hierarchical manner. I can open any one of those user stories. If I click on a user story, I see the details on the right. And user stories still have some user story descriptions, but also has some acceptance criteria here and has some scenarios here. So those are the scenarios. So there's 24 scenarios here written for this user story. There's one test set, there's 24 ad hoc tests, there is one risk for that user story, there's 4 tasks that the team will have to perform for that user story, and there's one document associated with that user story, and there has been 3 changes made to that user story. This is how you can see everything. There's so many other things. You can have attachments. You can ask people here to do the online review, or you could look at what people have said in the review, because clicking here, but I don't see any number here which tells me that this user story was not submitted for review or the scenarios. But again, and there's also approval process. You can decide on who's supposed to approve this. Of course, for a user story, sometimes it's straightforward. In Agile projects, the approval stuff is not that important. But you can imagine if you have requirements, if you have test cases, if you have test sets, some people have to approve them, and they have to approve them in certain order. So that's why everything is here. But again, because there is no number written on top of this, that means that we have not used approval authorities in this user story. There are 4 other user stories that are related to this one and so on. So if I were to click on scenarios, for example, that will show me all the 24 scenarios that have been written for that user story. Okay, and again, the fields are here: the frequency of occurrence, the consequences of failure or the impact of failure, the probability of failure. I can see the testing priority here. It tells me other data about the scenario, and I can open any scenario as I want, and it gives me even more details. That's now the traceability between user stories, scenarios, and test cases down here. So this is the details about the scenario title, scenario description, expected behavior is here, but then it shows also how many test cases have we written for this scenario, how many exploratory or ad hoc tests we have written. Well, of course, this is just for testing purposes. We have only one test case here, and obviously that test case has failed. It is in red, and the field is failed. If I were to click on this, guess what? It's gonna open test case for me. So that is the test case that failed, test case number 8, and all the details about it, and the expected results, the actual results, and so on. The breadcrumbs at the top here help you navigate back to where you want to be. I can navigate back to the user story if I want it to be. Then about the online collaboration. So let me go here, down here, and say online review this user story. Review this user story with scenarios. So if I were to click on this, I can now simply say, please look at these scenarios and let me know. And I submit that. When I do this, everyone in the team, of course, the spelling checker is gonna work first to make sure that I did not have any typos. And now an email goes out to everyone that is in the team. If I open my email now, I should see an email message that says Magdi, Hannah, or Samuel. Actually, Samuel wants you to review those scenarios and provide your feedback. That's what I wanted to show you at this point. I want to leave some time to answer some of the questions if you have any questions, because I have only 6 minutes left. So let me go back to my presentation here. I have a few questions here. Let me answer them quick. Someone's asking about, I understand that the requirements are bad, but what about BDD, behavior-driven development and testing? Well, behavior development and testing is nothing more than saying, given this and this, then do this. So it is really a way of scenario. It's a form of a scenario-based development and testing, except you are including both the scenario and the preconditions and the expected behavior on one statement. I've tried it. I've tried even to teach it to people. It's very hard to follow. If you're following BDD, good luck, because I personally did not like it at all. Certainly you can, if you have a good process where you can use BDD and you can get people to review those phrases, then make sure that they get reviewed carefully by developers, by everyone else, and good luck with that. Imagine the scenario development process has been developed over the years, and I have simplified them. People see it is simple enough. I'm not going to say behavior-driven development is bad. I'm going to simply say, although it has the word the behavior in it, I think the way you write those behavior statements is what's difficult about it. Another question says, could test cases equal scenarios? And the answer is no. Scenarios are not the same as test cases. Scenarios, as you can see, are a much higher level than test cases. So you normally would take a scenario and write a bunch of test cases, maybe 5, maybe 10 test cases. Why? Because the scenario describes only the high level situation or condition that will be encountered. And they don't have the details of the test case, such as preconditions, post conditions, things like that. If you are using use cases and you write scenarios within the context of use cases, all right, as I said earlier, Scenarios within the context of use cases are much more detailed, and they do have preconditions and post conditions, and they even have the steps. Now I can find an easier way to convert the use case scenarios to test cases. Why? Because use case scenarios already have a lot of details. The scenarios that I'm talking about today are very high level, one phrase that describes situation. So the final answer to your question simply is you can treat scenarios as being high level test cases. I don't see any other questions there. Thank you so much for joining me today in this webinar.